So today we have Emily Bliss, physical therapist, mom, and incredible runner. Emily and I met over the summer through a women's mountain biking group, and we hit it off straight away. And I'm so happy to have Emily join us today because we're going to run through some basic injury prevention and some information about sort of common injuries that runners experience. Emily's probably a little bit shy to say, but she's not just a runner, but an incredible runner, having run Boston how many times?
3 times.
3 times. So quite an accomplished runner. Also now living in Bend, Oregon. So we're kind of neighbors, and doing some mountain biking, has done triathlons in the past, and into trail running and on road running as well. So welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks for having me. Like Mary said, I love running, and it's definitely evolved over the years, especially as I've become a mom. But we used to live in Boston, where I worked with a lot of runners, a lot of triathletes, um, and just loved running in the city. So now that we live here in Bend, I am still a physical therapist. I'm also a running coach, and I just love running and working with runners and promoting injury prevention. So, welcome to evidence based running injury prevention. Let's get started. Oops, let's see. Okay. So, true or false? Running too much causes injury. Running on pavement causes injury. Running causes knee osteoarthritis. If you have flat feet, you are at risk for injury. Running on hills causes injury. And you should stretch before your race to prevent injury. So all of those are actually false. If you run on pavement, it doesn't necessarily cause injury. Same thing with knee osteoarthritis. There's a lot of misconception that if you run too much, you're going to give yourself osteoarthritis in your knee. Or if you have flat feet, you're at risk for injury. If you run on hills too much. So all of these things we'll talk a little bit about, but a lot of misconceptions are out there. So just keep that in mind. So why do we run? There's a lot of different options for exercising, but there are so few variables when it comes to running. All you need is a little bit of time and motivation, shoes, and some running clothes, and you can get out the door, and anybody can do it. You can run in pretty much any weather, and if you have a little bit of time, then that's all it's going to take. So some interesting facts. Physical inactivity kills more people than smoking and obesity combined. And one of my favorite facts is that 30 minutes of activity per day can decrease your risk of death by 63%. So if that's not a reason to get out the door, I don't know what is. 30 minutes, that's all it's going to take. And it doesn't even have to be running. It can just be physical activity, walking, running, cycling. But if you can decrease your risk of death, then that's a pretty awesome stat. So people are made to run. There's some really great evidence that shows because we stand up tall and we have short arms and legs and short little parallel toes with a long Achilles tendon and large glutes that we are just meant to run. We have an exceptionally high maximum endurance speed, which means compared to other mammals, we can run for long distances at a higher speed. So think marathon running, think ultra running. Like we actually were made to do that. So why are we getting injured? If we're really actually made for running, why are there so many running injuries? 60 to 70% of running injuries are actually training errors. So think decisions that you make, what you do when you head out the door, hop on the treadmill. And the cause is maladaptation of tissues. So that means that your tissues aren't adapting to the stress that you put on them necessarily. And intrinsic factors include things like your biomechanics. What does your gait look like? How are you running? What imbalances do you have in terms of strength or flexibility? What kind of motivation do you have? Are you someone that just has to get out the door every single day and not take a break? Or are you somebody that is really inconsistent in your training? So those are all intrinsic factors that can cause injuries. Then there's mechanical things like shoes. And then extrinsic factors are things like tripping and falling, or the surface that you're running on, or running in the cold, just little things that you maybe can't control but are outside your body. So how do we prevent these things? So it's all about tissue adaptation. So gradual changes to your training program is what it's all about. If you do too much too soon, your body's not going to be able to adapt to that stress. And if you slowly and gradually increase your training program and are really smart about it, that's how you can have calculated mechanical stress. So your body wants to adapt to the stress that you're putting on it. But if the stress exceeds its capacity to adapt, that's when you see an injury. So example of that might be um, running too far too fast. You're super excited to start running again. So you run every single day and you run 5 miles. Or I had a patient recently who wanted to run 10 miles for her long run, but she thought every long run every week was supposed to be every day. So she ran 10 miles every single time she ran instead of gradually building up her mileage and really keeping track of it. So she got really injured. And there's a high incidence of running injuries. 65% of runners experience injury every single year. And in marathon runners, it's up to 90%. And that's really, really high, especially when you consider why we're getting injured, which is mostly going to be training errors, which is preventable, which is why you have a coach, a great coach. So less frequent injury in experienced runners. So think people who are, winning the marathon, people who run over and over again, or people who have done lots of different marathons or have just been running for years, whether you're racing or not, your body gets used to it. And that's the tissue adaptation. That's sort of knowing your body, being smart about it, and then your body just knows what to do the more you run, as long as you're careful. So I do want to talk about the 5 most common running injuries. And this is true for inexperienced runners as well. So inexperienced to novice runners, intermediate runners are going to experience more like knee pain, foot pain, versus a really experienced runner, racer, is going to experience usually like higher hip injuries, low back injuries, things like that. And that's not always true. It can be anything, anywhere, but the more novice intermediate runner is going to experience these injuries. So patellofemoral pain syndrome, that is in the front of your knee. So if you picture your kneecap, you can get pain sort of all around the kneecap or in the tendon that attaches your kneecap right down to the knee. The pain is sort of diffuse. Sometimes it's there. Sometimes it's there when you run. Sometimes you can run through it. Sometimes there's swelling. Sometimes there's not. Sometimes it's both sides. Sometimes it's one side. And that is something that, sometimes it's okay to run through and sometimes you just can't run at all. But that's one to be really aware of because it's very treatable, but it does sort of have to be treated. And often will happen if there's an imbalance with things like glute strength or quad flexibility. The way that you run, like what shoes you're wearing, can really, really make a difference. For example, if your feet aren't strong and doing a lot of work, and you wear big bulky shoes, your knees are going to take up a lot more impact because your feet aren't going to. And so that's where you're going to get a little bit more need for tissue adaptation around your knee because everything isn't working as well together. Next one is IT band syndrome. This is probably the one I see the most often, especially in newer marathon runners or people who are trying to increase their distance and didn't increase it slowly enough or didn't have a really good base. Or did a race with a lot of hills in it and weren't planning on it. So IT band syndrome is when you feel pain on the outside of your knee. It's typically sharp and it's pretty impossible to run through. So once it sets in, it's really, really hard to run. Usually you have to stop, and then it's usually sore with things like going up and down stairs. Um, Walking is often fine, but as soon as you start running again, it's gonna just kick right back in. And with IT band syndrome, it's very treatable. It's often due to tightness of your quads and sometimes through your hamstrings, but also maybe some weakness through your glutes, or just not as good of control um, on single leg. So we treat that by working on making sure you have good mobility and then making sure you have really good single leg control. Because running ultimately is a single leg sport just over and over and over again. And little micro movements of your knee can cause some tightness patterns. And that's where we see IT band syndrome a lot. Um, it's something that's not going to go away typically if it's not treated. You'll feel better if you stop running, but usually as soon as you start running again, it's just going to kick right back up in the same spot at the same mileage. But the good news is it's rarely doing permanent damage. It just is irritated, and so it's pretty easy to treat if you can get on top of it really quickly. Um, Foam rolling is probably the most common thing I give for people to foam roll their quads, but there's other factors involved as well. Um, Plantar fasciitis, if you've had this, you know it. It is that sharp pain along the bottom of your foot, in the arch of your foot. It feels like someone is stabbing a knife in there when you walk or you run. And this is common with people who don't have super strong feet. Um, it can be treated. Sometimes this one can linger for a while. If you are pregnant or have had a kid, sometimes this one can get a little bit worse, but I see this in men probably just as equal as I see this in women. Um, Calf tightness is one of the things that can be involved, or calf weakness. Um, and again, it's just imbalance and making sure that you're gradually increasing your training. So one thing that can make this worse is running up hills, doing hill repeats. So if you decide you're super motivated and you head out the door and you do a regular run and then a speed workout and then a hill workout the next day, that's when something like this is probably going to crop up. Tibial stress fractures. That is a great sign of your body not adapting to your training because there's too much stress on the skeleton. So there's two different kinds of tibial stress fractures. Your tibia is the bone just below your knee that connects your knee to your ankle. And you can get a stress fracture in the front, which is just a little crack on the bone. And sometimes it's multiple cracks. Or you can get it on the inside of the bone. If you are brand new to running or you haven't run in a long time and you have a heavy heel strike, so you come down and you hit your foot on the ground, you're more likely to feel a shin splint in the front. Those don't heal quite as well, but they are very treatable, especially if you play around with your gait, your cadence, um, and your strength actually. The medial tibial stress fracture, which is on the inside of your tibia, um, tends to do a little bit more with foot control and how you land and what's your mechanics like. So we talked a little bit about that with IT band syndrome. If you don't have really good single leg control and knee control, and that comes down to glute strength, like actually the outside of your hip. If that's not strong, it's hard to control your knee. If you can't control your knee, your foot's probably going to overpronate in a little bit. But stress fracture is a hard red flag to no running. So if you can avoid that at all costs, that's probably your best bet. Because some of these you can run through a little bit, or at least train up to a certain point. But stress fracture is going to sideline you. And then knee meniscus injuries. And these are more, you're not going to necessarily get a meniscus injury unless you do too much too soon. So if you're adapting properly, your tissues are actually going to try to support you more, right? So they feel that stress from the running, and your body is really good at adapting to that stress. Because if you do too much, or you're tripping and falling, or you don't listen to your body, that's when you start to get some breakdown. And then the number one injury in older adults, and I would add to this, especially older men, is Achilles and calf injuries. And I often see this in somebody who doesn't have a lot of foot strength and has really tight hamstrings and calves. You can get thickening at your Achilles tendon and like a big bump on it. It's very treatable, but it can also that can take a while to get better if you wait till it becomes chronic. So if there's one slide that you take away today, it's this one, because this is going to be true for all of your training. And it's a stress quantification scale. So if you look at that bottom line, which is time, and the green line, which is minimal stress, but like create adaptation zone, versus the red line, which is you can't adapt any more beyond that. The bottom line of no mechanical stress and time is if you were sitting on the couch all the time, nothing would change, right? Your body's not going to be any different. If you run a little bit every day and don't, you will plateau, or you don't, maybe you don't have goals, or you're not running farther every so often. You're just sort of going to stay the same, which is fine. Your body will adapt to that certain point. If that's your goal, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you have the goal to run a little bit further, or run a little bit faster, or maybe do a race, or running more frequently, whatever your goals are, you have to get into that adaptation zone. And that's that green line, right? So you can see if you follow that green line and that blue line over top of it, your training should be through your adaptation zone. And as you train in that adaptation zone, that green line is going to increase. So your threshold to tolerate training is going to be a little bit higher the more you train through that zone. But if you press beyond into that red zone, which is where your body can no longer adapt, it's going to start breaking down. That's when injuries are going to happen. So think back again to if you're super motivated and all you want to do is start training, and you don't want to wait for adaptation because you're super motivated. So you head out the door and you run 5 miles. And then the next day you do a speed workout. And then the next day you run 5 miles. And then you do a hill workout. And then you do a long run. But last week you didn't run at all. That's going to be too much adaptation. And you're going to go into that zone of too much stress on your tissues, not enough time to adapt. So it's just gradual training. Increase the load and listen to your body. So how are you going to know where that zone is for your body? One is working with your coach, working with Mary. She is creating a plan for you that is very thoughtful and can work with you on sort of a larger scale and try to predict what's going to be your zone. And then personally, when you are experiencing specific symptoms, how to adapt things. So if you have pain during running, or if you have pain after that lasts more than 30 minutes, those are signs that injury is on its way. Or if you wake up in the morning or in the middle of the night and your body is just super stiff, that's a sign of overtraining. Okay, so in order to minimize risk factors, the more experience that you have, the less likely you are to become injured. If your weekly mileage is 40 or less, you're less likely to get injured. So think people who are running a lot higher mileage, it's a lot more stress on their body. A lot of professional runners are running like 100 miles a week, but they're also getting massages every week and PT probably a couple times a week. So they're really trying to address everything, but they're going for max adaptation without injury. If you have a previous injury, you're more likely to get injured again. And I see that all the time, especially with IT band syndrome. If it's not treated, it's just something that comes back over and over again. And if you're super competitive, if you are, and this is one of those intrinsic factors again, if you're super competitive and you have a hard time following a training program because you just want to go and you are motivated to get out the door and you always run as fast as you can every single time, things like that are going to affect your training adaptation because you're going to exceed your body's capacity to adapt. Um, so interestingly, most of these are behavioral. These are a lot of intrinsic factors and they can be changed. So nothing about your alignment or your posture or your body mechanics. Again, 60 to 70% of running injuries are training errors. So it really comes down to the decisions that you make. I like these two running calculators, the Jeff Galloway Metric Mile and Jack Daniels running calculator. And they're just good tools, especially if you're not working with a coach, that you can sort of see what paces might be the most appropriate for you to run. You don't want to just go out and run as fast as you can every time. And if you have the goal to get faster or to run farther, then keeping track of specific paces that you want to run can be really helpful just so that you have a target. And if you want to run faster, it gives you targets to work towards, but you have different thresholds for different types of specific running. Okay, stretching, yes or no? What does the research say? Do you need to stretch before you run or after you run? Um, the research pretty much says it's fine to stretch. It's fine to static stretch separate from your run. It's important to warm up before you run, and that might include some dynamic stretching, which is moving while you stretch. But you don't generally want to do a static stretch before you run, which is sit down, put your leg out, and stretch your hamstring for a minute, especially if you're going to do a speed workout. Warm up is so important. Working on your range of motion is so important, but static stretching before can actually increase your risk of injury. So there's some positive effects if you do stretching at a distance. Personally, and this is anecdotal just from being a physical therapist and working with patients, I think things like mobility, foam rolling are super helpful. I think that it does help prevent injury, but it isn't necessarily going to increase your range of motion. Um, Sometimes stretching can be more helpful, but I think in order to take what you did in your training and get back to your normal range of motion, back to your baseline, that's where mobility training can be really helpful. Otherwise, you can get into these patterns of tightness as your body is adapting to your training. And that's when you can also start to see some tissue breakdown or a change in your form. Okay, so cross training. This is one of the biggest most helpful things that you can do, and it's strength and flexibility, just working on your imbalances so you can maximize your biomechanics, which means being efficient when you run and not having tissue breakdown by making sure that you're efficient, that you have the strength and you have the power for increasing your running distance. So running in itself, you'll slowly adapt. But if you have the strength to support those distances, that's when you're going to start to really see some good changes. And it improves your body awareness and coordination. Oh, and it can stress your tissues in a different way, which helps avoid overuse injuries, so that you're not always doing the same activity over and over again. So you can strengthen your glutes, your quads, or your calves, and without just running. And that way you'll be able to push yourself a little bit further because you don't always have the same stress on your body. So one is I see most common, weak glutes, that's your butt muscles, especially hip. Um, Weak core stabilizers, abdominals, deep abdominals, and poor balance and coordination. So standing on one foot, you'd be surprised the number of runners that actually can't stand on one foot. And running is a single leg sport, so you have to have really good single leg control. And then for flexibility, I tend to see tight quads, tight hip flexors, or tight calves and plantar flexors, which are basically just the back of your lower leg behind your ankle. So, in conclusion, gradual progression during training leads to safe tissue adaptation. Slowly at a time. That's all you need to do, and thoughtful. Doing too much too soon can cause injury. Injuries can often be prevented by behavior modification and decreasing training errors. So, behavior modification, keep that in mind. 60 to 70% of running injuries are training errors. And then it's all a balance. You need the strength, you need the endurance, and you need the mobility. And then smart training that comes back to behavior. So it's all a balance and it all makes sense. Your body wants to adapt and work with you, um, but it can't if you exceed its capacity to adapt. Questions?
That was great, Emily. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
Um, I had a couple of questions just thinking through the slides. We'll keep
Yep.
it quick so we can keep this to just the half hour. One of the questions I had when you talked about some of the common running injuries was the link between, say, the stress fracture injuries and
Mhm.
nutrition, because that is the topic for next week. But can you
Yeah,
maybe just quickly run through that?
sure. Nutrition is so important for tissue health. And I'm not a nutritionist or a
Mhm.
dietitian. This is sort of outside my realm, but I certainly see it. And especially in female athletes who maybe don't know how to have the correct nutrition, so they're not fueling their bodies appropriately. Um, with a stress fracture, the biggest risk you see is in bone density. And I used to work with dancers, you see this a lot. So if you're trying to be really thin and you're not eating as healthy as you could, or maybe you just don't know what to eat, your bone density might not be as strong as it could be, which means it's not going to be able to adapt as well. It's going to break down sooner because you don't have the nutritional backing or the bone density to um, support the repetitive movement.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then you don't heal nearly as fast. That's probably the biggest thing is you see really slowly healing fractures and
Mhm.
lots of injuries.
Sure. Sure. One last question, and that is, can you maybe talk about, I think one of the biggest takeaways from your presentation, and particularly something I see with new runners, is this idea of this gradual progression. So, for example, following a training plan or working with a coach. But I think there's something really important that you brought up, and maybe if you can expand a little bit, and that is you also have to listen to your body. So just because you have this perfectly written training plan, that doesn't take into account all of your other life stresses.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
how do you make those decisions, or advise runners to make those decisions when they maybe wake up feeling really rotten and they have a long run on their schedule or a hard run on their schedule?
That's a really good question. And I think that's the hardest thing, especially for runners who tend to be motivated go getters. You think you're going to miss a run, you're willing to push through an injury to get that run done. So, yeah, it's really hard to take a step back and say, okay, cross training is really beneficial. Maybe I bike today, or maybe I take the day off. um, Listening to your body and knowing that you can make modifications is so helpful. And maybe the modification is a day off or a couple weeks off if your body really needs it. Um, but if you're lucky enough to be working with Mary, that's where she can work with you and say, "Hey, thank you for telling me that like your knee hurts when you're running. Yeah, don't go do a speed workout. That's not smart. You're going to get more injured if you do that. Try this instead. Do a strength workout. You can get your heart rate up, and there's a lot of training that you can do that's going to have some good carryover to running. Obviously, the most specific running sort of target exercises are going to be running and ones that support running. But I've had people run marathons by only being on the elliptical or mostly being in the pool. I've seen people train so hard up to the day of the race and then have a horrible race. And I've seen people be injured like 2 weeks before and taken that last 2 weeks off to totally rest and do nothing and have the best race of their life because they did that. And I see that more often than not. So you just have
Yeah.
to listen to your body. But it's hard. It's hard to know. So ask questions and get help for sure. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's an awesome way to end. Thanks for spending your time and sharing your knowledge with everybody
Thanks,
today.
Mary. And let me know if you guys have any questions. I'm always here to answer them. And you have my
Will
email.
do.
Feel free to pass it
Yeah,
along to Facebook.
I wonder if I'll put it on the Facebook post that has this same picture for people to recognize it afterwards. Any additional questions that people have, you can post them on that Facebook post. And we can also share Emily's email address if you message me directly. Maybe I won't post it publicly.
Okay, good point. All right.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Emily.
you, Mary, for having me.
Have a great day.
Thanks, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.